one person we haven't really gotten into yet is Darius Maroney.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about Darius.
Well, Darius is kind of the quintessential. He's kind of the Rambo character. If Rambo is just like a regular guy, if Rambo didn't go to whatever that, bumfuck town in like Oregon or whatever it was, and like do on a rampage because the people tried to fucking like ruin his life for no reason. If Rambo is just a normal guy, he would probably be Darius Maroney. Because Darius Maroney is a guy who left his like small town and went and joined the military to get, like, on a small town on Mars. In this case, obviously, that's a big difference, of course. He left a small town on Mars to get away from like the dead end jobs and the crappy family conditions, and went and joined the military to serve in the Draconis crisis, and was sent to Titan and ended up spending like 3 tours there. And he served with a unit called the SOAR, which means I know there's technically a unit called that in the United States military, which obviously exists now. But in the Spacer Saga lore, SOAR stands for Special Orbital Assault and Reconnaissance. These guys are kind of like the ODSTs or Hell Jumpers from Halo, in that they are deployed from low orbit, basically dropped in special drop suits, and they are deployed in relatively small numbers behind enemy lines to cause havoc. They're basically the 24th century equivalent, or 24th century equivalent of paratroopers, in that they deploy behind enemy lines, cause havoc, try and do recon. They're kind of like a cross between, I know what they are. They're a cross between like the long range reconnaissance patrol guys, who basically were the predecessors to modern Rangers that were around in Vietnam, and regular paratroopers. And because of that, they're kind of an elite unit, and they've always had kind of a sort of a storied history to them. And they've been in some tight spots. When Darius was on Titan, he was in some really bad operations, because in the book that we're working on right now, the Europa Goodbye, there's some flashbacks to his first operation, which was severely botched up because basically the enemy got intel or something along those lines of where they were going to drop, and they were fired. They dealt with a lot of missiles and flak and so on as they were dropping, and they got scattered, and they had to regroup in small numbers and try and salvage the operation as best they could. But another thing about Darius's time on Titan, which is probably the most famous thing, the thing that is kind of like the MacGuffin, it's kind of like the MacGuffin of Darius's story. There's a battle called the Battle of Diablo Pass, but his unit was sent on a reconnaissance patrol, forced reconnaissance patrol into this valley, which became known as Diablo Pass after the battle, and they were essentially ambushed by a much larger force. It's kind of like the Battle of the Ia Drang in Vietnam, like the first major battle of the Vietnam War, where this like battalion or something, maybe not even a battalion like that. I think it's a battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division was sent into the Ia Drang Valley, and they were basically ambushed by like 2 divisions of NVA. And it's like, oh, I guess we're gonna have to fight our way out of this now. So that's kind of the position these guys found themselves in. They either were going to fight or they were going to be wiped out, because the Draconis were not taking prisoners on that day. The Draconis famously don't really take prisoners, and even if they do, they would put them to gruesome death, probably in front of a camera. It's not really a good situation, so you pretty much want to fight to the death or fight your way out or whatever. And there's a line that I've actually already written for the Europa Goodbye, which is the first book that stars Darius as a main character, and he's talking with another character who's like a fellow veteran of the Draconis Wars, and he tells him that he was with this unit, and the guy says, "Weren't they at Diablo Pass?" And Darius says, like, "Yeah, they were." And the guy says, "I didn't think anybody made it out of Diablo Pass." And Darius says, "Yeah, neither did I." And of course, that's kind of a dramatic like writer's flourish. But I've always loved little things like that, because it's stuff like that tells you, oh, yeah, this guy's seen some shit.
Yeah, I had a thought as you were explaining. So, in 2 of the works that we have going right now, we've got Europa Goodbye that's going to come out in 2024. And we have the Erebus Effect that comes out in 2024. And I like how there's kind of a symmetry to them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of, you've got, they're very, very similar and some fun. But granted, you had this formerly married couple whose marriage didn't work out because they're a couple of veterans, and that makes sense. And relationships are hard, and
to put it mildly.
And after the war, they both become police officers of a sort, right? Janet polices robots. Darius is a detective on a space station.
Basically, yeah. Well, Europa is a moon of Jupiter, but yeah, it's the same situation. Darius is basically doing the job that Micheal Garibaldi does on Babylon 5. Exactly. He's basically a guy who goes out and stops people from breaking the law on a place where everything is supposed to run smoothly so that all the stuff can happen that needs to happen.
The Europa Goodbye and the Erebus Effect are two versions of a similar story where you have traumatized combat veteran police officer investigates a big bad mystery.
Yeah.
But each one, and granted, I'm a co-author on it, so I'm a little bit biased toward them. But each one really, they're not like with Babylon 5. They're not shot for shot remakes.
Yeah.
They're very different stories.
Yeah.
The general beats of many of the general characteristics of the plot are the same. The driving forces of the narrative are the same, but they go in rapidly different directions. What made you want to tell stories about emotionally traumatized combat veterans who investigate large conspiracies?
It's something that just kind of tumbled together. It's
go for it.
The first story I ever started writing, the first real story I ever started writing, was longer than like a short story or just sort of like a flash story for like a class or something. I did at IUPUI in the, I think, spring of 2015 is where I was going to undergrad, and it was my first film class.
Yeah,
it was the same professor that we had together.
Sure,
it was my first class I took with her, and the final project she assigned for the intro to film class was for students to come up with a like fantasy film, like a film we would make if we had unlimited resources, could hire anyone we wanted, could hire any director, whatever. The film I came up with, I ended up starting to write.
Right.
And I've actually got chapters of it written somewhere that we can probably eventually edit and pull from and turn into a book someday. The main character in that story is a guy named Kadreyu Nafarada. Now, he's a Zarin. He's a Zarin living in the Zarin society after the Zarins do their whatever thing.
Right.
He is kind of it's called Outliers. The story is literally called Outliers, and the reason for that is that Kadreyu, first and foremost, is an outlier himself. He doesn't really fit into the normal orthodox fabric of Zarin society. And because of that, he is kind of ostracized and not really trusted by a lot of the other Zarins. But it's also why he gets this case that is assigned to him that they don't really know what to do with.
Yeah.
And that kind of narrative bent has always stuck with me, of someone who doesn't really fit within the normal prescribed orthodox society norms, because it can be very easily argued that, for better or worse, traumatized combat veterans don't really fit within a normal society. I'm not saying that's a good thing by any stretch, but I think a lot of people who've been to war and seen some shit, as I was talking about Darius a minute ago, and then come back, would probably agree with that notion that, this is me speaking as them, that they would probably say, I don't really fit in with the people around me. There's been entire movies made about people who come back from war and then don't fit in and either end up being like a bouncer or
the first Rambo.
The first Rambo. Again, going back to that, there's been entire movie franchises made about characters like this, and that type of character has always fascinated me, because it's someone who doesn't fit in but also has agency, because they then decide, because they've been taught by their background, by their circumstances, by obviously through their training, through their experiences. Well, even though I don't fit in, I can still do things to affect my surroundings. things. So it's not someone who just sits back and I'm not saying necessarily this has to be a veteran, because there's plenty of people who do this who have been through other situations or who have never even been in uniform, who are very active agents in their environment. But I think the thing that fascinates me about specifically about this type of character, the Janets, the Dariuses, the Rambos, whatever, is that they have been through such trauma. They've been through probably the most traumatic event in human society, the interstate or even intrastate warfare, and then they have to go back to regular society and try and fit in like a square peg in a round hole, and yet they still can get stuff done. They can still get the job done, and they still. That's the thing about Darius. That's the thing about Janet. It's ironically probably why their marriage fell apart, because they're both such hard-headed fools who just can't let things go. But that's why they both make such good officers, good agents, good detectives. Because Darius, going back to who we've been talking about for most way through this episode, the reason he makes such a good detective, and the reason he is such an important character in the Europa Goodbye, obviously he's the main character, but the reason why the story progresses is because he can't let things go. Like the part of the story that I just worked on, the last chapter I wrote, the last full chapter I wrote, his immediate supervisor, his lieutenant, is basically telling him, listen to me, Darius. You're going to toe the line if the people who run Europa tell you to toe the line. Not just because they not just because they sign our paychecks, but because they can make people disappear who get in the way of business. And Darius basically, says, yeah, sure thing, whatever. But then basically goes off and does his own thing, because he realizes, oh, this guy who's like trying to give us the glad hand routine is behind what's going on. I don't trust him. I don't trust him any further than I can throw him, and I wouldn't even touch him. So he has that kind of stubbornness that makes him pursue injustice. And that's the kind of thing that I have always identified with too, because I think you would probably agree with this, Darius, I don't know if it's an autistic trait, if it's a me trait, if it's a me as an autistic person trait, if it's or whatever. But it sticks in my craw when stuff doesn't add up, when people are mistreated, when systems are unequal, when injustice is systemic. And that's why a lot of my characters, whether they are outliers or not, are very much that way too. That they're not able to sit comfortably while the system is screwing over people that they could do something to help. And that's the thing about Darius, is that even that's the whole reason I wrote Darius's character, or am writing Darius's character, is that he is a guy who's been through the ringer. He's been through the Battle of Diablo Pass, where he's basically like one of maybe a handful of survivors from his entire company or whatever, who made it home alive. And yet he's still, and he's burnt out. He's cynical. He's sarcastic. He's a little bit, but he's still got the stubbornness to say no. It's kind of like, again, there was an episode of Babylon 5 that I watched just the other day with my dad. It's the one where Garibaldi goes on a drinking binge because of I can't remember the circumstances now. We could probably recall it if we tried, but it's basically it's a character who's had it's a character who has worldly experience, and has hardships, but manages to pick himself up in the morning and go to work and get the job done.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, because because there's plenty of times in Darius's life, and there's plenty of times in the Europa Goodbye even, where he could probably just break down and bawl or cry or just go numb, but he doesn't, and he picks himself up and he goes about his business.
I so often identify with characters like what you're talking about, the ones, and like you said, it doesn't have to be it's not necessarily a veteran thing. Although as a veteran, it's a thing I identify with, where I know that I happen to my life. My life does not happen to me.
Yeah.
The summation of the philosophy, it takes a lot of courage to happen to your life. It is terrifying because if you accept the responsibility as the driving force of your own life and narrative, then you're responsible if it fails.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can't deal with it. They can't handle it. So life happens to them because they're afraid. And And yes, there are extenuating circumstances that are beyond people's control. And that's not to say bad things don't happen to good people that try really hard.
Mm-hmm.
But what you and I are talking about here is of a mindset where regardless if bad things happen, right? Or regardless if there are bad circumstances, regardless if there are evil agents in our midst, you always happen to your life. Your life does not happen to you, because if you happen to your life, then there is the possibility to build, to achieve, to reach. You are a shining example of that, because 3 years ago you're working the meat counter at Meijer, right? Like you were 3 years ago. Your biggest hope was they would put you on the overnight shift, stocking shelves so that you wouldn't have to talk to customers.
Exactly.
Man. And then you just spent, what, 6 months working at NASA?
I spent a year and a half working at NASA, and I spent 6 months working there in person.
There you go.
Like going on center with a badge and like talking to scientists and like people who worked there for 30 years.
You rub shoulders with the most brilliant people on the planet. And that's because you wanted to, because life happens to you.
No, I happen to life.
You know what I meant.
Yes.
I'm pretty tired.
No, it's fine, dude.
Because you happen to your life.
Yep.
And
I mean, let's break out another Sylvester Stallone movie to reference. Rocky Balboa.
Yeah.
It's not how many times, it's not how hard you do hit. It's how many times you can get hit and keep getting back up. Yeah. It doesn't matter if life hurts. It matters how you respond and how you keep going.
I saw that movie Christmas of 2006 because I was on leave. I was in between basic training and advanced AIT, and that was how I got through basic training. It's the mantra of it ain't about how hard you get hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward, because that's how winning is done. I wasn't what you call good at being a soldier in basic training. I got through it because I kept trying. And yes, the army was short people. And yes, there was a major ground war. So, they at a certain point, they're like, well, he'll figure it out. He keeps trying. But he wants it. He'll get there. But that was how. There were people that didn't make it through my basic training company. Some people, they flunked out. One guy went insane and started peeing his pants and like trying to hug the drill sergeants. And they weren't receptive to it, we'll say.
I can imagine.
like he tried to sit next to the drill sergeants at the chow hall and ask him if the Matrix was real. And I won't get too deep into details, but they were not receptive to his presence. And that's probably one of the things that draws me to you as a friend, is because if I didn't happen to my life, I mean, best case scenario, I'm an assistant manager at a Wendy's living in the trailer park I grew up in still. Yeah. And then not to toot my own horn, but man, I have really affected my own life. And just like you have really affected your life.
And I think, if anything, kind of going back to Darius' story, not to take away from
the
story of Derwin Lester,
the
beautiful human that he is. The thing about Darius' story is that when we meet him in the Europa Goodbye, he has lost a step or two.
Yeah.
He has kind of fallen, I wouldn't say fallen off the wagon, although he does kind of do that a little bit too, to a certain extent. He has kind of fallen back in terms of having agency in his own life because his marriage collapsed. He's been living on Europa, kind of basically just punching his card, basically just pulling the lever, so to speak. And if anything, the story of the Europa Goodbye and possible subsequent stories in that arc are that Darius learns how to be an agent in his own life again, because he realizes again, my life may be shit. I may have a broken heart from from the woman that I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with leaving, and our relationship going up in smoke, and all of that. And he's basically just relegated to being a cop and just nabbing bad guys. But he realizes he still can be a force for, if not always good, then at least not always bad.
I agree. And now granted, at this point, we've only got the first 7 chapters primed for release. So I haven't read all of the Europa Goodbye. I've read the outline.
Yeah, neither have I.
But so we're working on that still. But one of the things I like a lot about Darius' character is how when we meet him in the Europa Goodbye, he's not at rock bottom so much as swimming in melancholy.
Yeah.
And he's kind of at the tail end of a real bad 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if you have a bad year and then 4 more after that, and you're like, well, holy fuck.
There's a quote that I wrote. I may end up using it in the book, I may not, but it's basically I think it's a quote basically for one of his superiors, maybe not as a lieutenant, but one of his superiors saying, for the first couple of years you were here, you were a real shitty officer. Yeah. then you started cleaning up your act and you got a little better. Now you've got potential. If you keep going the way you're going, you'll be okay, or you could do really great. But please, for the love of God, don't sink back into being a shithead. Something like that.
Can you just not be like sad all the time?
Yeah.
No, I get that. But anyway, I think we will wrap up this episode there.
Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts about Darius?
No, I think I'm excited for readers and our listeners, obviously here today, to get to meet Darius, to get to meet his ex-wife, and to meet many other characters in this new year.
For the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin.
And I am Nick.
And we will see you next Monday morning at 0700.